Well, I think it's interesting that the week before, the OECD called on Canada actually to spend more and to actually pull its weight on the international stage. What we found in this report was we looked at the job loss figures in Canada, and we compared that to the number of jobs that the stimulus plan is proposing to create. So this would be a maximum figure of the government, about 189,000 jobs. The problem is that we've already lost 189,000 jobs, and then some. We've already lost 296,000 jobs since this crisis began. So what we did is we calculated the exact date when we had lost the number of jobs that the stimulus package would propose to create. And that date was January 26th, the day before the budget came down. So we'd already lost all the jobs that the stimulus package would create the day before it was even introduced. And so I think that that speaks to the scale of the problem, and that the size of the stimulus package isn't appropriate to the scale of the job loss problem and the scale of the loss of GDP problem.
And then there's the question of the G20's objective for spending for wealthy countries of 2% of GDP. How has Canada's commitment stacked up against that objective?
So the federal government proposed a budget of 1.9% of GDP. But upon reflection, reading over some of the work from the Parliamentary Budget Office, we found that that 1.9% of GDP is a bit of an accounting game, if you will. What it doesn't include is $8 billion worth of cuts and service increases that came out of the economic and fiscal statement that have yet to be announced exactly how that's going to pan out. That's a significant portion of that stimulus package. As well, the other big section of that is that most infrastructure spending is expected to be matched by the provinces and by municipalities. So the government is counting in their federal stimulus package, they're counting what other people are spending. They're counting what the provinces are spending, they're counting what municipalities are spending. They'll even match funding in some cases for community groups. And so what we're seeing is the federal government is not taking account of what they're spending. In fact, they're expanding the number to try to get to 2% through a set of accounting games. And one of the challenges with that structure is that if there isn't matching funding, then those stimulus dollars don't enter a particular community. So the poorer communities that don't have additional dollars to match the federal dollars simply won't get stimulus funding, and that money will go to richer communities, which is the exact opposite of what you'd want in a stimulus package.
So when the federal government claims to be spending 2%, they're actually spending an awful lot of other people's money. In many cases, the other people don't have the money to spend. Yeah,
so the net stimulus that we've calculated is probably about 0.7% of GDP after you take out provincial and municipal spending, as well as this $8 billion from the economic and fiscal statement. So it's significantly smaller than what it appears on paper.
You're concerned with the effectiveness of the spending announced in the budget. Can you tell me about that, please?
Yeah, so the other thing that we saw that came out at the end of March was the government released its report on how it expects to spend the stimulus dollars, and in particular, when that money would hit the ground. And so, as everyone's aware, I don't think there's any potential of this money not being spent fast enough. There's a real potential of it being spent too slowly. And so if we take a look at tax measures, for instance, we find that the least effective tax measures, that is to say broad-based tax cuts, are implemented immediately on April 1st, and some, like the renovation tax credit, are implemented retroactively to the last tax year. However, the measures that implement that affect low-income Canadians, like the working income tax benefit, aren't implemented till March of 2010. So what we see is the least effective tax measures, broad-based tax cuts, are implemented first. The most effective tax measures, tax incentive for low-income Canadians, are implemented last. And so we've got the reverse of what we would expect if we were thinking about economic effectiveness. So that's on the tax side. If we look on the infrastructure side, there's a similar pattern occurring. So what we're seeing is we're seeing infrastructure dollars being dispersed in summer and fall, as opposed to being dispersed April 1st. And the reason for that is that the government did not want to use pre-existing mechanisms. They wanted to create a whole new set of mechanisms and bureaucracy to get this money out the door. So instead of using the gas tax transfer, for instance, or similar transfers for provinces, they need everyone to come together at a table, agree on projects, match funds, and so on. And because of that, we're delaying these critical job-creating infrastructure projects until halfway through the year, in some cases 3/4 of the way through the year. And so I think there's broad agreement that infrastructure spending has a large job creation effect, but there's also broad agreement that it is the most likely to see delays, and the government is contributing to that delay by slowing down the date at which they're dispersing those funds.
Now, that question of when they disperse the funds has been a critical issue raised by Liberal leader Michael Ignatieff. He declared that he was going to put the government on probation and subject them to some form of monitoring on a regular basis to see how the money is going out. But he also supported the budget, which included the kind of mechanisms you're talking about that delay the disbursement of funds. I guess that the first report has been issued. There's another report due in June. What do you think is going to happen when that report is issued? What do you think the government will say? What do you think the Liberal Party will say?
Well, in all fairness, this initial report came out at the end of March. The government's fiscal year starts April 1st, and so we couldn't actually reflect on any spending because it hadn't happened yet, except for some of the retroactive spending like the renovation tax credit. And so we get an idea of what the plan is going to look like. But it's really in June in that report where we'll see actually how much of that money has been spent. And so that will be a much more telling report in terms of the effectiveness of the government in getting this money out the door. But even taking a look at the plan, it's it's the reverse of what you would expect if your goal was efficient economic stimulus.
What do you think the government should be doing right now to stimulate the economy and to help people affected by the crisis?
Well, there's things the government can do right away that have cross-party support. For instance, reform to EI has been an ongoing issue. The government has spent a significant amount of money, and shockingly, they've managed to spend all of this money and not change the entrance requirements at all for EI. We have the lowest rate of coverage right now of EI of any time since the Second World War, since the EI program was initiated.
Lowest rate of the lowest proportion of the working population on EI? On the program?
That's right. The lowest proportion of unemployed Canadians actually receiving EI. So we're around 40-45%, whereas the average is probably more around 80 or 100% leading up to the 1990s when the changes happened. In addition to that, the government could easily remove the restrictions in terms of matching funding for provinces and municipality. That would relieve this delay. We could move that money out the door today instead of waiting until summer and fall to move the money and waiting for matching funding. And if the government actually took responsibility for the budget as it being their own as opposed to counting other people's funding, there's definitely a significant portion of room there where they could increase the infrastructure spending themselves, move it directly through pre-existing mechanisms without a new level of bureaucracy, and therefore expedite these projects, these infrastructure projects.
David Macdonald, thank you very much.
Thank you.